Okay, so first things first. Nigeria, right? It is a federal state. So there's 36 states. Abuja is the capital. Worth noting, a lot of people think it's Lagos because Lagos is the biggest city, not only in Nigeria but also in Africa. But that's not the case, right? So we have Nigeria separated into 36 states, and the more important thing, right, is the ethnic composition. Nigeria is a really fragmented state. You have the House of Fulani in the northwest, in the southwest the Yoruba, the southeast the Igbo, and those are just three major ethnic linguistic groups. There are 250 to 400 separate ethnic groups depending on how you classify things. So really, Nigeria should not exist. But the British colonial legacy is why Nigeria does exist. Nigeria is not even a term, not even an African term. It's the Niger River, right? And the Niger River Basin is what created the idea of Nigeria. It was some British colonial ruler's wife that coined the term. And that's why we have a lot of boundaries that are drawn that normally when we look at boundaries that occur very naturally, they're usually based on physical features. Okay. However, in this case, in Africa, just in general, there's a lot of straight lines that were drawn, just as Africa was being divided up back in the 1880s during the Berlin Conference. So anyway, the point that I'm making here is that there's a lot of ethnic conflict, and these ethnic conflicts really are going to undermine legitimacy. And one of the big issues that Nigeria has to reckon with is how to build legitimacy in a multinational state, right? Because the state is Nigeria, nations that inhabit the state, right? Like our Yoruba, our Igbo, our House of Fulani, so on and so forth. All right. So, and also it appears, just so you guys know, that if you say something in the chat, I'm not going to see it. So if you have a question, um, actually, if you have a question, still type it in the chat, and then I'll collapse the slides here every 5 minutes or so just to see if there's any questions. So that's fine. Okay. So one thing also worth noting is that Nigeria is a rentier state. Right. So if we look at the uh, distribution of resources, in particular, you're going to see that that's also a source of ethnic conflict because certain ethnic groups are going to be in greater control of more valuable resources than other. And rentier state is a term that you should know. And if you're not really sure what a rentier state is, if you feel like that's a term that's been used a lot, but you're still not entirely sure what that is, really it's an economy that's heavily supported by state expenditure. So think of it as a landlord, right? If you live in a building that has several units, and you pay rent, there's somebody that owns that building and they are receiving rent from, if you live in a building that has 10 units, all 10 of those units are paying rent every single month, and the income that is generated by that building is based on rent. And, in a rentier state, the government is the landlord, and they receive rents from outsiders using land and resources, right? Nigeria has a ton of oil deposits. And so that is something that, maybe a corporation like British Petroleum, right, BP, they may want to build oil wells, and take advantage of the oil deposits in Nigeria. Nigeria says, sure, come on in. We have oil fields, but you got to pay rent, right? I mean, it's going to cost you to use our oil fields. So that's what a rentier state is. And the problem with a rentier state kind of ties into the resource curse, right? Which is that when the government receives rents from outsiders, if too much of their income, too large a percentage of their income is generated, in this case by exporting oil and leasing oil fields, then you don't really need the labor of the people anymore to pay for government spending, right? If governments are able to pay for their spending, whatever their budget is based on the rents they are collecting, then they become dependent upon those rents, and they neglect any sort of public policy that using tax dollars. So does that make sense? Someone say yes or no or maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I sort of basically talked about this already, but about the rentier state and the ethnic conflicts that create that. But one thing that is also worth noting is with these ethnic conflicts, if you're a minority group in Nigeria with no feeling of any sort of connection or kinship to other groups, and the state comes calling and they want to benefit and they want to subsidize the rest of the country based, with people that are not your ethnic group, not your kin group, um, you may want to do your own thing. And that's how we end up getting the Civil War with Biafra back in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s. So always remember when it comes to our uh, our country study is we're looking at system, structure, function, right? So the kind of system that we are here is a presidential system and a federalist system. Muhammadu Buhari is the president currently. Interesting guy, by the way, as the president. He was the person. He Back in the 80s, there were a bunch of military coups that kept deposing rulers, and he took power through a coup. And then he left, and then he came back and was elected as a president, which I think is just kind of interesting. So Nigeria used to be a parliamentary system, not presidential. And the important thing, right, when you guys are thinking about this, is what is the difference between those two systems? It's not just the name, right? A parliamentary system means the legislative and executive branches are fused together. And so oftentimes that allows for a stronger party system, but it also creates a weaker executive. So a presidential system creates a stronger executive. And the reason this became a presidential system was because no prime minister was able to build any sort of majority due to ethnic fragmentation. There were so many ethnic groups with so many different interests that with all these different parties that were forming, if you have 50 parties in parliament, none of them are going to have a majority, and building a coalition is what's going to be required, and that might be difficult if they don't get along very well. So the president was meant to be a unifying figure, and you can see that in the way that the president is elected, in that he or she must receive 25% of the votes cast in 2/3 of the states in Nigeria, right? And so what that means is that the president cannot be a purely regional candidate. It can't be just somebody that was able to bank. For example, the House of Fulani are the most numerous ethnic group or nation within Nigeria. And on sheer numbers, if you were going with a plurality system, they would probably win. However, in this case, they say you have to win that 25% from 2/3 of the states to make you acceptable to a larger number of ethnic groups. And it's also worth noting the executive is the strongest structure in the country. Federalism and checks and balances don't really operate. Despite the fact that they're in the Constitution, they don't really operate. Governments at the local level are completely dependent upon the federal government, and a lot of the checks and balances written into the Constitution kind of fall to the wayside because of the strength of the president. There have been some changes in Nigeria's executive branch, and in large part, one big takeaway, and this is probably something I would be including in my country fact sheet about the various major historical events, is that there has been the influence of the military dictatorship with all of these coups and these military strongmen has heavily influenced the type of executive branch that we have today, with sort of an authoritarian nature that in some cases suspends the rule of law. And this constant regime change is a large reason why the government suffers from a low level of legitimacy. So you have to look at the military probably as another structure when you're looking at the structures in your fact sheet and you're saying, executive, legislative, judicial. Other military is a pretty important one. And in many cases, military is really the only national unifying structure in the country. So I'm going to pause here, okay, and check. Do we have any questions?
So you said earlier that with Nigeria, the checks and balances in the constitution don't really work. So is it federal on like in writing, but confederal in practice?
Well, what is confederal?
I mean, not confederal, unitary. My bad.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. Yes and no. I mean, yeah, pretty much yes. Pretty much yes.
So
It is a unit. It is very similar to Russia, and that is federal in
okay,
theory and unitary in function.
got it. Okay.
And also, so let's talk about elections for a second, because who has been a source of great dispute and conflict within Nigeria over the last several decades. Nigeria has made a lot of progress in the last couple of decades. They ran 4 regularly scheduled popular elections. These military strongmen back in the 80s, they were constantly like, listen, we did a coup d'etat, meaning it was a forceful removal of government and a regime change, and the military took over. And they said, we're doing this until Nigeria is ready for us to return democracy to the people, but that is our goal. We want to give democracy back. And rarely would that happen. But eventually, democracy does come back. However, a lot of the remains of this military strongman system don't go away, and there's a lot of questions about the legitimacy of elections, and so eventually what is set up is the Independent National Electoral Commission, or INEC, and INEC is it suffered from a lot of the same corruption that was plaguing the rest of the country. But since 2011 or so, it's kind of been a force for good. They put a technocrat in there, somebody who was a professor. He purged the voter rolls. There are examples of villages that had 50,000 people registered to vote, even though their population was like 4,000. And they also introduced the open secret ballot system, where voters would register at polling stations on election day, and then they would stay there until results were posted locally, so they could verify and make sure that everything was sort of as it was supposed to be. I mean, it's hard to imagine that is, that's a huge suck on people's time, but that's one thing that happened. But the point that I'm making here is that INEC has actually helped to increase legitimacy within the electoral process over the last 10 to 15 years. All right, so let's talk legislature. Takeaways from here, pretty much it's the same as our legislature. All right, we have an upper house, a lower house, Senate, House of Representatives. The way that it's elected is all single member district, first past the post. But there's a couple of things to take away here. One is that there used to be a lot more parties, but INEC has sort of regulated the electoral process in such a way as to cut down on how many parties are able to run in a given election. And number 2 is that the legislature is meant, one of the challenges, right, in governing a multinational state like Nigeria is building legitimacy. And so these senators and these House of Representatives the districts are drawn so they can represent a diverse district rather than a purely ethnically or religiously homogenous district. Overall, the legislature is very weak. Very little power over the president. Very rarely is the legislature an effective check on the president. Every now and again, it will assert itself, but this is sort of what happens when you have a patronage system. The judiciary, okay, the president is receiving recommendations, and then they're confirmed by the Senate. Early on, the judiciary was fairly independent, and this was sort of a vestige of the colonial system, where the British had a very strong common law legal tradition, but these days they have judicial review in theory, but not really in practice. It's also worth noting that the court structure is pretty much the same as like the United States court structure, where you have this local, state, and federal levels. However, an important difference is that in the northern region, where the majority population is Muslim, Sharia law is also used concurrently. So there are Sharia law courts as well as sort of Nigerian constitutional law courts. And this can complicate things sometimes, but it's actually a way of building legitimacy for the government because in the same way that, the UK devolves its power structure to ethnic to various regions like Wales and Northern Ireland, Scotland. Here they're saying, listen, we understand that a large part of our country is Muslim, and that a great number of them want to use Sharia law in their legal proceedings, and we're going to allow for that. Okay. If you're dozing off right now or not really paying attention, I would pay attention because I'm going to talk about a few things that I think are sort of making you guys confused. So there's a few terms that get used a lot when we talk about the bureaucracy and sort of the bureaucratic systems that we have. And one is rentier state, which I talked about. Another one is parastatal organizations. Another one is corporatism. And another is patron clientelism. Okay? And I'm going to sort of try to explain all three of those real quick, what they actually are, what those terms mean in the abstract, because I think that there is probably still some confusion about what those actually mean. So a parastatal, okay, is a semi-autonomous or potentially autonomous government agency. It's a corporation, essentially. It's owned by the state, and it's designed to provide some sort of commercial and social welfare service. And usually it's going to produce some sort of good or service that in other countries would be carried out by private enterprise. Okay? A good example of this is Mexico, which is Pemex, right? The oil company. That is a parastatal. In Iran, we have parastatals that operate a little bit differently. Those are called the bonyads. And they sometimes are called charities or these, foundations for, I can't remember what it's called. It's like the foundations for the deceased soldiers of the revolution, something like that. Anyway, but they sort of funnel money to the regime. And then Nigeria is more similar to Iran than it is to Mexico, which is that they have private interests controlled by the state that are not nearly as autonomous as some of the parastatals are in Mexico. And they're usually fairly corrupt. Okay. Now, this matters because this fits into a larger system of what is called corporatism, right? Where the government allows political input from selected interest groups outside of the government structure. So business, labor, other interest groups, they're going to bargain with the state, usually over policy. Normally that policy will be economic, wages, hours, regulations, things like that. And it's oftentimes a feature, corporatism is oftentimes a feature of authoritarian systems because it's letting the government select the organizations that represent the public, right? But the allowance of such organizations makes it appear less authoritarian. So in a pluralist system, right, people, if you have an interest, you can create a group. Now you have an interest group and you can try to achieve some measure of power in the political process. When the government says these are the ones that are allowed, there's a large number of interests that are going to be cut out or sort of diluted. But, you say, Mexico, Nigeria, those are democratic regimes, not authoritarian. And why then are we associating corporatism with them? Well, this is true, but both Mexico and Nigeria have a history of authoritarianism, and it's not entirely incompatible with a democratic system because a citizen's interest can actually be recognized if they are able to, say, for example, elect the heads of those interest groups. The difference is how much influence do they have? Mexico, they have a lot of influence, right? And Iran and Nigeria, not so much. So That's sort of the macro view of corporatism. The micro view is when we talk about patron clientelism, right? Which is a less structured means by which the state gets support from people. So in both corporatism and clientelism, a smaller group of people is going to benefit than would benefit in a pluralist structure that builds inefficiency, that creates the conditions for corruption, and it's going to diminish the legitimacy of the government. We see clientelism in China, Russia, Mexico, and Nigeria. All four of those countries have pretty robust patron-client systems. So if we're thinking how these all connect, right? Governments, oftentimes governments that suffer from the resource curse, governments that are rentier states, they will be able to use the patron-client system um, to award jobs, oftentimes in these parastatals. Usually, those parastatals fall into a corporatist system, which is a limitation on the amount of interest groups that can exist. Okay, let me stop here for a second because I just went over a whole bunch. Um, do you guys have any questions on that? You can put them in the chat. You can uh, ask me verbally.
Wait, so the parastatals, that's how the patron-client systems are basically implemented?
Well, so if you think about this, like I'll give you an example. I am a let's say for example that the government says, okay, there's really only one corporation, one parastatal that will be allowed to uh, oil in Nigeria, and so the parastatal way that anyone that works in the oil industry is able to express their interests with the government. Okay, the people who are in the positions to benefit or to profit from that oil industry are often going to be a function of the patron client system where they have been appointed into these high oil industry because of their connections and support for the president, for example.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Um, do you feel like you can say just yes verbally or in the chat? Like, do you feel like you have a better understanding of how this parastatal corporatism patron client relationship all sort of works?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We
That's
we see a lot more of this in developing countries because a lot of these developing countries existed for a very long time in a colonial framework, and in that colonial framework, they existed as a raw materials and resources. And so what happens is they're not building they when they achieve independence, they don't have the systems in place to allow for any sort of thriving democracy or any sort of thriving diversified economy. They're like, well, our whole purpose was to provide sugar or oil as a colon and everything that was built in our country by our colonial overlords was meant for that purpose. And so all of a sudden, there's a huge power vacuum. Someone steps in, and they just continue to take advantage of those same structures that existed in the colonial period. This stuff's complicated, guys. So where that leads us in the bureaucracy, okay, is that this corruption and bribery sort of has a trickle down effect. Okay, there's a pretty big civil service within Nigeria. Largely, that's a remnant of the British days. Most people view it as corrupt, and these many of these bureaucrats, like I said, they treat there's a term, a specific term that you should know that's in your book, prebendalism. And prebendalism is essentially that these bureaucrats, say you're the head of the department of, I don't know, repairing roads in Nigeria, you're treating that kind of like your own individual little fiefdom, and you say, I'm not going to do anything for anyone who's not giving me some sort of kickback or bribe or greasing the wheels a little bit for me. Now, this is not. I don't want to overgeneralize, because there's a lot of people. There's a that get into government service for the right reasons, and they want to help, or they want to serve their country, or they like to work. But ultimately, there is a great deal of corruption in this system, and you see that really. It's this give and take in countries where the greater the bureaucracy is, which in theory is providing greater services for people, the more potential there is for people to use the government for their own benefit and advantage. America, we got a pretty big bureaucracy, and there are a lot of people who get a lot of contracts who happen to also be pretty big political donors to people in that bureaucracy. So this is why Jeff's a libertarian. So when it comes to political recruitment, it's all about patronage. The rentier state reinforces this. When the oil is where the money's at, patronage will dole out jobs in the oil industry at the expense of developing other industries for the good of society and the economy. So ultimately, political recruitment is, a great deal of Nigeria is ethnically fragmented, and it comes down to local kinship ties. And so we see a lot of patronage jobs that work within that framework. If we're talking media, right, we're kind of moving into our link institutions here. Big takeaway, generally speaking, Nigeria has a pretty independent press, which is good. I mean, there's it's something that you would not necessarily expect given the authoritarianism under these military leaders in the 1980s and early 90s, but they have a pretty independent press, although in some cases, right, journalists can be, if they're in the wrong area, threatened or subjected to violence. If we're looking at legitimacy and sources of legitimacy, okay, elections are always a source of legitimacy when they're run free and fair, and Nigerian elections have become more free and more fair over the last 2 decades. However, constitutionalism is another source of legitimacy. If we believe the government has a constitution that is going to restrict what it can do or cannot do to people, and that is going to create very clear avenues by which the government can exercise its power, that increases legitimacy. And this is the idea of constitutionalism, right? Which is the acceptance of a constitution as a guiding set of principles. But this has really eluded Nigeria because many autocrats have felt free to disregard it across all these various regime changes. And it's really hard to build support for constitutionalism when so many work around the system and don't apply it to themselves or patronage networks. So, features of the Constitution, we've talked about this, pretty much all of this already, Sharia law, bicameral, federalist, all that good stuff. The last thing I just want to hit here is the history and political turbulence, and a lot of the Nigerian history has a great deal of impact on the Nigerian state today, right? One is religion, the fact that Islam was introduced in the 9th or 10th centuries in northern Africa, that spread into Western Africa, and so a large part of Nigeria fell under these Muslim caliphates that existed in the 14, 15, 1600s. Then there was the colonial area where Christianity was introduced. This intensified ethnic politics, and we still see that today, which is why northern Nigeria is allowed to practice Sharia law concurrently with constitutional law. Then we have the colonial era, and the British bring they try to impose their own government structure upon Nigeria, and that is also going to increase ethnic politics because the government, the British government, tried to basically they would pit these ethnic groups against each other via a reward system, and they did this as a way of managing the colony through what was called indirect rule. And so, all this is to say that Nigeria has suffered from a great deal of turbulence based on ethnic conflict that has sort of been imposed upon them through its colonial history. Skip that, skip that. Buhari's our president. We talked about ethnic cleavages already. And, okay, last thing, parties. So you would think that many parties are going to fall along the lines of these ethnic divisions, and for in large part that was the case. However, there have been some changes that say that parties have to have like 5% of support in a certain number of states in order to be able to run an election, and so it's minimized number of parties. But for the most part, people are not loyal to a party; they're loyal to a candidate, and the candidate uses a party. So sometimes parties come and sometimes parties go. It's very similar to what happens in Iran. And I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, parties, elites, we talked about citizens. Okay, yes. So, that is Nigeria in a nutshell.